During World War II, it has been estimated that between 19,500 and 50,000 members of the Imperial Japanese military surrendered to Allied combatants prior to the end of the Pacific War in August 1945. Soviet troops seized and imprisoned more than 500,000 Japanese troops and civilians in China and other places. The number of Japanese soldiers, sailors, marines, and airmen who surrendered was limited by the Japanese military indoctrinating its personnel to fight to the death, Allied combat personnel often being unwilling to take prisoners, and many Japanese soldiers believing that those who surrendered would be killed by their captors. Western Allied governments and senior military commanders directed that Japanese POWs be treated in accordance with relevant international conventions. In practice, though, many Allied soldiers were unwilling to accept the surrender of Japanese troops due to a combination of racist attitudes and reports of atrocities conducted against Allied troops. A campaign launched in 1944 to encourage prisoner-taking was partially successful, and the number of prisoners taken increased significantly in the last year of the war. Japanese POWs often believed that by surrendering they had broken all ties with Japan, and many provided military intelligence to the Allies. The prisoners taken by the Western Allies were held in generally good conditions in camps located in Australia, New Zealand, India and the United States. Those taken by the Soviet Union were treated harshly in work camps located in Siberia. Following the war, the prisoners were repatriated to Japan, though the United States and Britain retained thousands until 1946 and 1947 respectively, and the Soviet Union continued to hold hundreds of thousands of Japanese POWs until the early 1950s. Some were not returned from Siberia until the last 1990s. Japanese attitudes to surrender. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army adopted an ethos which required soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender. This policy reflected the practices of Japanese warfare in the pre-modern era. During the Meiji period, the Japanese government adopted Western policies towards POWs, and few of the Japanese personnel who surrendered in the Russo-Japanese War were punished at the end of the war. Prisoners captured by Japanese forces during this and the First Sino-Japanese War and World War I were also treated in accordance with international standards. Attitudes towards surrender hardened after World War I. While Japan signed the 1929 Geneva Convention covering treatment of POWs, it did not ratify the agreement, claiming that surrender was contrary to the beliefs of Japanese soldiers. This attitude was reinforced by the indoctrination of young people. The Japanese military's attitude towards surrender was institutionalized in the 1941 Code of Battlefield Conduct, which was issued to all Japanese soldiers. This document sought to establish standards of behavior for Japanese troops and improve discipline and morale within the army, and included a prohibition against being taken prisoner. The Japanese government accompanied the Senjinkun's implementation with a propaganda campaign which celebrated people who had fought to the death, rather than surrender during Japan's wars. While the Imperial Japanese Navy did not issue a document equivalent to the Senjinkun, naval personnel were expected to exhibit similar behavior and not surrender. Most Japanese military personnel were told that they would be killed or tortured by the Allies if they were taken prisoner. The Army's field service regulations were also modified in 1940 to replace a provision which stated that seriously wounded personnel in field hospitals came under the protection of the 1929 Geneva Convention for the Sick and Wounded Armies in the field, with a requirement that the wounded not fall into enemy hands. During the war, this led to wounded personnel being either killed by medical officers or given grenades to commit suicide. Those who know shame are weak. Always think of preserving the honor of your community and be a credit to yourself and your family. Redouble your efforts and respond to their expectations. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying you will avoid leaving a stain on your honor. Senjinkan. While scholars disagree over whether the Senjinkan was legally binding on Japanese soldiers, the document reflected Japan's societal norms and had great force over both military personnel and civilians. In 1942, the Army amended its criminal code to specify that officers who surrendered soldiers under their command faced at least 6 months' imprisonment, regardless of the circumstances in which the surrender took place. This change attracted little attention, however, as the Senjinkan imposed more severe consequences and had greater moral force. The indoctrination of Japanese military personnel to have little respect for the act of surrendering led to conduct which Allied soldiers found deceptive. During the Pacific War, there were incidents where Japanese soldiers feigned surrender in order to lure Allied troops into ambushes. In addition, wounded Japanese soldiers sometimes tried to use hand grenades to kill Allied troops attempting to assist them. Japanese attitudes towards surrender also contributed to the harsh treatment which was inflicted on the Allied personnel they captured. Not all Japanese military personnel chose to follow the precepts set out on the Senjinkan. Those who chose to surrender did so for a range of reasons, including not believing that suicide was appropriate or lacking the courage to commit the act, bitterness towards officers, and Allied propaganda promising good treatment. During the later years of the war, Japanese troops' morale deteriorated as a result of Allied victories, leading to an increase in the number who were prepared to surrender or desert. During the Battle of Okinawa, 11,250 Japanese military personnel surrendered between April and July 1945, representing 12% of the force deployed for the defense of the island. Many of these men were recently conscripted members of Boatai Home Guard units who had not received the same indoctrination as regular army personnel, but substantial numbers of IJA soldiers also surrendered. Japanese soldiers' reluctance to surrender was also influenced by a perception that Allied forces would kill them if they did surrender, and historian Niall Ferguson has argued that this had a more important influence in discouraging surrenders than the fear of disciplinary action or dishonor. In addition, the Japanese public was aware that U.S. troops sometimes mutilated Japanese casualties and sent trophies made out of body parts home. From media reports of 2 high-profile incidents in 1944 in which a letter opener carved from a bone of a Japanese soldier was presented to President Roosevelt, and a photo of the skull of a Japanese soldier which had been sent home by a U.S. soldier was published in the magazine Life. In these reports, Americans were portrayed as deranged, primitive, racist and inhuman. Hoyt in Japan's War, The Great Pacific Conflict, argues that the Allied practice of taking bones from Japanese corpses home as souvenirs was exploited by Japanese propaganda very effectively, and contributed to a preference to death over surrender and occupation, shown, for example, in the mass civilian suicides on Saipan and Okinawa after the Allied landings. The causes of the phenomenon that Japanese often continued to fight even in hopeless situations has been traced to a combination of Shinto, Meshi Hoko, and Bushido. However, a factor equally strong or even stronger to those was the fear of torture after capture. This fear grew out of years of battle experiences in China, where the Chinese guerrillas were considered expert torturers, and this fear was projected onto the American soldiers, who also were expected to torture and kill surrendered Japanese. During the Pacific War, the majority of Japanese military personnel did not believe that the Allies treated prisoners correctly, and even a majority of those who surrendered expected to be killed. Allied attitudes. The Western Allies sought to treat captured Japanese in accordance with international agreements which govern the treatment of POWs. Shortly after the outbreak of Pacific War in December 1941, the British and United States governments transmitted a message to the Japanese government through Swiss intermediaries asking if Japan would abide by the 1929 Geneva Convention. The Japanese government responded stating that while it had not signed the convention, Japan would treat POWs in accordance with its terms. In effect, though, Japan had willfully ignored the convention's requirements. While the Western Allies notified the Japanese government of the identities of Japanese POWs in accordance with the Geneva Convention's requirements, this information was not passed on to the families of the captured men, as the Japanese government wished to maintain that none of its soldiers had been taken prisoner. Allied combatants were reluctant to take Japanese prisoners at the start of the Pacific War. During the first 2 years following the U.S. entry into the war, U.S. combatants were generally unwilling to accept the surrender of Japanese soldiers due to a combination of racist attitudes and anger at Japan's atrocities committed against U.S. and Allied nationals and its widespread mistreatment or summary execution of Allied prisoners of war. Australian soldiers were also reluctant to take Japanese prisoners for similar reasons. Incidents in which Japanese soldiers booby-trapped their dead and wounded or pretended to surrender in order to lure Allied combatants into ambushes were well known within the Allied militaries, and also hardened attitudes against seeking the surrender of Japanese on the battlefield. As a result, Allied troops believed that their Japanese opponents would not surrender and that any attempts to surrender were deceptive. For instance, the Australian Jungle Warfare School advised soldiers to shoot any Japanese troops who had their hands closed while surrendering. Furthermore, in many instances, Japanese soldiers who had surrendered were killed on the front line or while being taken to POW compounds. The nature of jungle warfare also contributed to prisoners not being taken, as many battles were fought at close ranges where participants often had no choice but to shoot first and ask questions later. Despite the attitudes of combat troops and nature of the fighting, Allied militaries made systematic efforts to take Japanese prisoners throughout the war. Each U.S. Army division was assigned a team of Japanese Americans whose duties included attempting to persuade Japanese personnel to surrender. Allied forces mounted an extensive psychological warfare campaign against their Japanese opponents to lower their morale and encourage surrender. This included dropping copies of the Geneva Conventions and surrender passes on Japanese positions. This campaign was undermined by Allied troops' reluctance to take prisoners, however. As a result, from May 1944, senior U.S. Army commanders authorized and endorsed educational programs which aimed to change the attitudes of front-line troops. These programs highlighted the intelligence which could be gained from Japanese POWs, the need to honor surrender leaflets, and the benefits which could be gained by encouraging Japanese forces to not fight to the last man. The programs were partially successful, and contributed to U.S. troops taking more prisoners. In addition, soldiers who witnessed Japanese troops surrender were more willing to take prisoners themselves. Survivors of ships sunk by Allied submarines frequently refused to surrender, and many of the prisoners who were captured by submariners were taken by force. U.S. Navy submarines were occasionally ordered to obtain prisoners for intelligence purposes, and formed special teams of personnel for this purpose. Overall, however, Allied submariners usually did not attempt to take prisoners, and the number of Japanese personnel they captured was relatively small. The submarines which took prisoners normally did so towards the end of their patrols so that they did not have to be guarded for a long time. Allied forces continued to kill many Japanese personnel who were attempting to surrender throughout the war. It is likely that more Japanese soldiers would have surrendered if they had not believed that they would be killed by the Allies while trying to do so. Fear of being killed after surrendering was one of the main factors which influenced Japanese troops to fight to the death. and a wartime U.S. Office of Wartime Information report stated that it may have been more important than fear of disgrace and a desire to die for Japan. Instances of Japanese personnel being killed while attempting to surrender are not well documented, though anecdotal accounts provide evidence that this occurred. Prisoners taken during the war. Estimates of the numbers of Japanese personnel taken prisoner during the Pacific War differ. Japanese historian Ikuhiko Hata states that up to 50,000 Japanese became POWs before Japan's surrender. The Japanese government's Wartime Power Information Bureau believed that 42,543 Japanese surrendered during the war, a figure also used by Niall Ferguson, who states that it refers to prisoners taken by United States and Australian forces. Ulrich Strauss states that about 35,000 were captured by Western Allied and Chinese forces, and Robert C. Doyle gives a figure of 38,666 Japanese POWs in captivity in camps run by the Western Allies at the end of the war. Alison B. Gilmore has also calculated that Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area alone captured at least 19,500 Japanese, whereas the Japanese forces in China were mainly on the offensive and suffered relatively few casualties. Few Japanese soldiers surrendered to Chinese forces prior to August 1945. It has been estimated that at the end of the war Chinese nationalist and communist forces held around 8,300 Japanese prisoners. The conditions these POWs were held in generally did not meet the standards required by international law. The Japanese government expressed no concern for these abuses, however, as it did not want IJA soldiers to even consider surrendering. The government was, however, concerned about reports that 300 POWs had joined the Chinese Communists and had been trained to spread anti-Japanese propaganda. The Japanese government sought to suppress information about captured personnel. On the 27th of December 1941, it established a POW Information Bureau within the Ministry of the Army to manage information concerning Japanese POWs. While the Bureau catalogued information provided by the Allies via the Red Cross identifying POWs, it did not pass this information on to the families of the prisoners. When individuals wrote to the Bureau to inquire if their relative had been taken prisoner, it appears that the Bureau provided a reply which neither confirmed or denied whether the man was a prisoner, although the Bureau's role included facilitating mail between POWs and their families. This was not carried out as the families were not notified and few POWs wrote home. The lack of communication with their families increased the POWs' feelings of being cut off from Japanese society. Intelligence gathered from Japanese POWs. The Allies gained considerable quantities of intelligence from Japanese POWs, because they had been indoctrinated to believe that by surrendering they had broken all ties with Japan. Many captured personnel provided their interrogators with information on the Japanese military. Australian and U.S. troops and senior officers commonly believed that captured Japanese troops were very unlikely to divulge any information of military value, leading to them having little motivation to take prisoners. This view proved incorrect, however, and many Japanese POWs provided valuable intelligence during interrogations. Few Japanese were aware of the Geneva Convention and the rights it gave prisoners to not respond to questioning. Moreover, the POWs felt that by surrendering they had lost all their rights. The prisoners appreciated the opportunity to converse with Japanese-speaking Americans and felt that the food, clothing and medical treatment they were provided with meant that they owed favors to their captors. The Allied interrogators found that exaggerating the amount they knew about the Japanese forces and asking the POWs to confirm details was also a successful approach. As a result of these factors, Japanese POWs were often cooperative and truthful during interrogation sessions. Japanese POWs were interrogated multiple times during their captivity. Most Japanese soldiers were interrogated by intelligence officers of the battalion or regiment which had captured them for information which could be used by these units. Following this, they were rapidly moved to rear areas where they were interrogated by successive echelons of the Allied military. They were also questioned once they reached the POW camp in Australia, New Zealand, India or the United States. These interrogations were painful and stressful for the POWs. Force was not used by Allied interrogators, though on one occasion headquarters personnel of the U.S. 40th Infantry Division debated, but ultimately decided against, administering sodium pentanol to a senior non-commissioned officer. Some Japanese POWs also played an important role in helping the Allied militaries develop propaganda and politically indoctrinate their fellow prisoners. This included developing propaganda leaflets and loudspeaker broadcasts which were designed to encourage other Japanese personnel to surrender. The wording of this material sought to overcome the indoctrination which Japanese soldiers had received by stating that they should cease resistance rather than surrender. POWs also provided advice on the wording for propaganda leaflets which were dropped on Japanese cities by heavy bombers in the final months of the war.